February 5, 1918, in the House of Commons, a British Member of Parliament asked a question that exposed one of the strangest contrasts of the First World War. Britain was under pressure. German submarines had sunk millions of tons of shipping. Food prices had risen, sugar was being rationed, and meat rationing was approaching. Families queued outside shops without knowing whether anything would remain when they reached the door. Yet the question was not about the food available to British civilians or British soldiers. It concerned the meat being issued to German prisoners of war held in Britain. The official answer was precise. Prisoners received 6 ounces of pickled beef on 2 days of the week and 6 ounces of fresh meat on 3 more, 30 ounces of meat each week, about 850 grams. The government added that the entire ration scale was under review because of the national shortage. 8 months later, another document recorded the official weekly ration on the German home front. It allowed 50 grams of meat, not per day, per week. The two figures are not a perfect scientific comparison. They come from different months, different ration systems, and different populations. A printed entitlement did not guarantee that the food actually reached every plate. British prisoners' rations had been reduced as submarine warfare tightened supplies, while German families with money or rural connections could obtain food beyond the official scale. But the contrast is still extraordinary. At one point in 1918, an enemy prisoner in Britain could be officially issued more meat in a single serving than a German civilian's entire weekly allowance later that year. This was not because Britain had escaped wartime scarcity. It had not, nor does it prove that German prisoners lived comfortably. Captivity meant armed guards, compulsory labor for many ranks, separation from home, uncertainty, boredom, and what doctors began calling barbed wire disease. The food reveals something larger. By the final year of the war, Britain had built a system capable of feeding an enormous army in France, rationing its civilian population, and maintaining hundreds of thousands of enemy captives throughout the empire. Germany, meanwhile, was still fighting with formidable armies, but its food economy had fractured. Imports had collapsed. Agricultural production had fallen. Horses, workers, fertilizer, coal, and railway capacity had been diverted to war. Official price controls encouraged hoarding and black markets. Food existed, but often in the wrong place, beyond the reach of the people who needed it. For German prisoners, the evidence arrived in the most ordinary form imaginable: bread, potatoes, vegetables, coffee, and, on designated days, meat. No surviving source allows us to say that every prisoner stared at his plate in disbelief. Some complained about English cooking. Some found the rations monotonous. Some were hungry. Conditions varied by camp, rank, work assignment, and year, but the records allow a more defensible conclusion. The prisoners were living inside the supply system of the enemy while receiving letters from a homeland whose own system was failing. By September 1918, German captives repeatedly heard from their families that nothing could be sent to them. One letter contained a bitter sentence: "If you knew what we have become, I think you would not even dare to ask us for a pin." That was the real reversal. The captive was supposed to depend on home for help. Instead, home was becoming the place that needed saving. And the story of how that happened explains why the First World War was decided not only by artillery, trenches, and generals, but by ships, farms, ration cards, railway wagons, and the ability to move food to the correct mouth at the correct time. Part 1. The Law Behind the Ladle. When the First World War began, there was no Geneva Convention of 1929 governing prisoners of war. That agreement belonged to the future. The principal written rules came from the Hague Convention of 1907. Article 4 required prisoners to be treated humanely. Article 6 allowed captor states to employ enlisted prisoners according to their rank and ability, provided the work was not excessive and was not directly connected to military operations. Article 7 placed responsibility for maintenance on the captor government. Unless the belligerents reached a separate agreement, prisoners were to receive board, lodging, and clothing on the same footing as the captor's own troops. Those sentences looked clear on paper. In practice, the war created prisoner populations on a scale Europe had never administered before. Millions of men were captured across several fronts. Camps appeared in factories, barracks, castles, racecourses, old ships, farms, and hastily constructed rows of wooden huts. Conditions depended on the resources of the captor, the efficiency of local authorities, the rank and nationality of the captive, and the stage of the war. The Hague Rules did not eliminate neglect, retaliation, hunger, forced labor, or violence. They established a standard against which governments could accuse one another, and against which neutral inspectors could report. Britain created a Prisoners of War Information Bureau in August 1914, as the Hague Convention required. Neutral diplomats inspected camps. The United States performed this role before entering the war in 1917. Switzerland later assumed many protecting power duties. Reports examined accommodation, sanitation, medical care, recreation, and food. The first British ration scale for internees in 1914 appears generous when read as a list: bread, meat, vegetables, sugar, tea or coffee, condensed milk, and alternatives such as cheese, peas, beans, lentils, or rice. Yet a ration table is not a restaurant menu. It was a regulated bulk supply from which prisoners frequently prepared their own meals. Ingredients could be unfamiliar, poor in quality, or badly cooked. Quantities changed as the war continued. Günther Plüschow, a German naval aviator who was held at Donington Hall before escaping, described the food there as very good, then immediately qualified the compliment. It was English, he wrote, so many prisoners did not like it. That small observation matters. It is evidence of adequate provision in one officer camp at one time, not proof of universal luxury. Donington Hall itself provoked political criticism because newspapers and members of parliament believed German officers were being treated too well. Officer camps also differed sharply from the lives of enlisted men assigned to hard agricultural or industrial work. By 1918, scarcity had reduced British prisoner rations. The government could not pretend that enemy captives lived outside the same economic system affecting everyone else. German U-boats attacked the ships carrying food into Britain. When imports tightened, camp scales tightened too. But the British state still had a legal and practical reason to feed prisoners. Hungry men became sick. Sick men required hospitals. Men too weak to work could not help farms, forestry operations, quarries, or construction projects. Poor treatment invited diplomatic protest and possible retaliation against British captives in Germany. Food for prisoners was therefore not simply charity, it was law, administration, labor policy, public health, and reciprocity. It was also politically explosive. Every ounce issued to a German could be described by a newspaper as food denied to a British family. Every visible comfort could be called a reward for the enemy. The House of Commons questions from February 1918 reflected that anxiety. Ministers did not answer with emotion. They answered with ounces. 6 ounces of pickled beef on 2 days. 6 ounces of fresh meat on 3. The bureaucratic language concealed the strategic fact. Britain still possessed enough organizational capacity to count, transport, and issue those ounces while it fought a global war. Germany's problem was not that it had forgotten how to count food, it was that counting had become easier than delivering. Part 2. Germany's confident calculation. Before the war, Germany was one of the world's great industrial powers. Its cities had grown rapidly. Its chemical industry led the world. Its railways, universities, steelworks, and engineering firms symbolized modern efficiency. That modernity depended on exchange. Germany produced enormous quantities of food, but its population also consumed imported grain, animal feed, fats, and other products. Historians disagree about the exact share. Pre-war estimates often placed imported food between 10 and 20% of national consumption. A commission appointed after war began calculated that imports supplied about 20% of calories, 20% of animal protein, and 42% of fats. The conclusion drawn in 1914 was reassuring. Germany could adapt its diet and withstand a long war. On paper, the argument was not absurd. A country that lost imported animal feed could slaughter some livestock and direct grain toward people. Consumers could replace scarce foods with domestic alternatives. Government could control prices and distribution. The chemical industry could compensate for imported materials. A disciplined nation could endure. The calculation failed because food was not a single national pile divided by 68 million plates. Food had to be grown on particular land by particular workers using particular horses, tools, seed, fertilizer, and fuel. It had to be gathered, processed, loaded into railway wagons, carried through a network competing with military traffic, unloaded in cities, delivered to shops, and sold at prices that encouraged farmers to release it. War attacked every link. Conscription removed agricultural labor. According to one major historical analysis, 2/3 of the male labor force in German agriculture entered the army. Horses were requisitioned for artillery and transport. Imports of nitrate from Chile disappeared, affecting both fertilizer and explosives. Coal shortages disrupted food processing and rail movement. Cultivated acreage fell. During the war, the land planted with wheat declined by more than 30%, rye by about 23%, and potatoes by more than 31%. Government intervention sometimes made matters worse. Officials established maximum prices to prevent exploitation. Farmers responded by withholding produce from legal markets, feeding potatoes to animals, consuming more themselves, or selling through illegal channels at higher prices. Provinces protected their own supplies. Cities accused the countryside of selfishness. Rural communities accused urban administrators of confiscation. The army had priority. So did workers essential to munitions production. Farmers possessed direct access to what they grew. Wealthy consumers could turn to the black market. The people most exposed were urban families with little land, few connections, and wages that could not keep pace with prices. This is why the phrase, "Germany starved," requires precision. Not every German starved. The countryside often ate better than the cities. Combat troops generally received higher priority than civilians, though frontline supply also deteriorated. Money and social position created alternatives. At the end of 1918, Allied troops entering parts of Western Germany reported cultivated fields and rural populations that appeared adequately fed. Yet in Berlin, the Ruhr, and other urban centers, large sections of the population lived with chronic hunger, poor quality substitutes, and severe malnutrition. Food was present inside Germany, but entitlement, transport, price, and state power determined who could reach it. The blockade intensified the crisis, but it did not operate alone. Germany had also gone to war with countries that had been major trading partners. Its merchant fleet was driven from the oceans. Neutral routes narrowed under Allied pressure. By 1918, German imports had fallen to roughly 1/5 of their pre-war volume. The result was not one clean mechanism called blockade. It was the interaction of economic warfare, lost trade, reduced agricultural output, military priority, failed price policy, unequal distribution, and 4 years of exhaustion. Germany had calculated calories. It had underestimated systems. Part 3. The Turnip Winter. The potato stood near the center of the German wartime diet. It was familiar, productive, and capable of providing large amounts of food from limited land. When the potato harvest failed in 1916, there was no equivalent replacement waiting in reserve. The winter of 1916 to 1917 entered memory as the Turnip Winter. The turnip in question was generally the swede, a root commonly used as animal feed. It could be boiled, mashed, baked, dried, turned into flour, stretched into soup, and presented under new names. None of these transformations changed the basic reality. People were eating a food they associated with livestock because potatoes and other staples were unavailable. The swede was not poison, and the entire nation did not survive on one vegetable. But the symbol endured because it captured the humiliating decline of everyday life. Meals lost fat and protein. Bread contained substitutes. Coffee became an imitation made from roasted grains, chicory, acorns, or other materials. clothing wore out, apartments went underheated because coal was scarce, bodies weakened. Malnutrition rarely kills in the theatrical manner of a battlefield wound. It makes other causes of death more effective. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and respiratory disease become more dangerous. Cold becomes harder to resist. Work consumes strength that the diet cannot replace. In 1918, influenza entered a population already exhausted by war and scarcity. The number of German civilian deaths associated with hunger and malnutrition remains disputed. Estimates vary widely, and an influential post-war German calculation that attributed more than 700,000 excess deaths directly to the blockade served political as well as statistical purposes. Modern scholarship warns against treating every excess death as the simple result of British naval policy. The safer conclusion is also the more revealing one. Hundreds of thousands suffered, mortality rose, and the causes included both Allied economic warfare and major failures inside Germany. Hunger carried political meaning. A ration card promised fairness, but a card was useless if the shop had no goods. A contemporary joke summarized the bitterness. The authorities promise you cards, but you do not receive the merchandise. Queues became places where anger circulated. Women who spent hours searching for food understood scarcity through direct experience. They saw who appeared to receive preferential treatment. They suspected farmers, wholesalers, officials, foreigners, Jews, and anyone else identified by rumor or prejudice. Food conflict deepened regional, class, and ethnic divisions. The black market exposed the weakness of official control. In Berlin, the illegal price of meat rose from a little over 1 mark before the war to more than 25 marks by September 1918. A ration scale could describe equality, while private purchasing power recreated inequality outside it. The army could not be isolated from the home front. Soldiers received millions of letters. German military and civilian mail approached 30 billion items during the war. A man in a trench might be better fed than his wife, yet he knew what was happening because she told him. Food parcels had once moved from farm and city homes toward the front. As scarcity deepened, the packages became smaller or stopped. By late 1917, one recorded parcel contained only meat and 2 apples. The physical contents of the box measured the condition of home more honestly than official propaganda. For a soldier, the absence of a parcel communicated several messages at once. His family had little to spare. The state could not protect them. The war was consuming the future he imagined returning to. Even a well-fed combat ration could not erase that knowledge. Then, in 1918, thousands of those soldiers became prisoners. Their connection with home continued through letters, but the direction of need had been reversed. Part 4. Britain almost loses the food war. It would be easy to tell this story as a simple contest between abundant Britain and starving Germany. That would be wrong. Britain was dangerously dependent on the sea. It imported food and raw materials from a global network connected by merchant shipping. The Royal Navy could restrict German overseas trade, but it could not make British cargo ships invulnerable. Germany's answer was the submarine. In February 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. The strategic calculation was clear: sink shipping faster than Britain and its allies could replace it, reduce imports, and force Britain out of the war before American power could arrive in decisive strength. The campaign came close to creating a national emergency. U-boats sank merchant vessels at a rate that alarmed the war cabinet and threatened stocks of grain and other necessities. In the spring of 1917, Britain held only weeks of wheat reserves. Voluntary restraint had not solved shortages. Prices rose, queues lengthened, and the unequal ability of rich and poor families to obtain food became politically dangerous. The response was not one miracle invention, it was organization. merchant ships began sailing in escorted convoys. The Royal Navy had resisted a broad convoy system for several reasons, including fear that escorts were insufficient and a belief that ships could not assemble or keep station efficiently. Experience proved the objections manageable. Grouped vessels were easier to protect, and U-boats faced a smaller number of concentrated targets moving with destroyers and other escorts. Shipping losses did not disappear, but the convoy system helped reduce them. New construction, American participation, patrols, mines, intelligence, route control, and improved anti-submarine measures worked together. Germany's campaign failed to force Britain from the war. Britain also rationed. Sugar rationing began in January 1918. Controls expanded, and by spring, meat and fats were included. The exact timing and scale varied by district during the transition, but the national system increasingly replaced queues and uncontrolled purchasing with registered customers and coupons. British rationing was not evidence of limitless supply. It was evidence that the state recognized limits and attempted to distribute them. That distinction is crucial. Scarcity becomes strategically fatal when government cannot decide priorities, measure stocks, control movement, or sustain public legitimacy. Britain endured shortages, but it retained access to world markets and the administrative ability to move food through ports, railways, military depots, civilian shops, and prisoner camps. The Empire and Britain's allies made that reach possible. Grain, meat, sugar, and fats could be drawn from North America, Australasia, India, the Caribbean, and other regions. This system depended on colonial power and unequal global relationships. It was not simply the neutral reward of efficiency, but in military terms, it gave Britain a resource base Germany could not match. By 1918, the British were sending more than £67 million, about 30 million kilograms, of meat to the Western Front each month. That number did not describe food consumed in Britain. It described food transported across oceans, unloaded at ports, carried to France, placed on trains and trucks, and moved toward millions of soldiers through a battlefield where a broken rail line or shelled road could interrupt the final miles. The U-boats had tried to break the chain at sea. The chain bent, but it held, and because it held, Britain could still debate how many ounces of meat to issue to the enemy behind its barbed wire. Part 5. Feeding an army of millions. The Western Front is remembered through mud, shell holes, and trenches. Behind those images stood one of the largest distribution systems ever built. Every soldier required food, water, clothing, boots, ammunition, tools, medical supplies, and fuel. Horses consumed enormous quantities of fodder. Artillery batteries required shells measured not in dozens, but in trainloads. A unit advancing several miles could create a supply crisis because its dumps, kitchens, and railheads remained behind. By 1918, a British division of roughly 12,000 men might require about 1,000 tons of supplies each day. That was the equivalent of 250 wagon trains. Not all of that tonnage was food. During heavy operations, ammunition dominated, but the figure reveals the scale of the machine. A division did not fight as 12,000 isolated riflemen. It fought as the visible point of railways, roads, depots, workshops, ports, ships, farms, factories, and clerical systems extending far beyond France. British soldiers were supposed to receive fresh or frozen meat when possible, along with bread or biscuit, vegetables, tea, sugar, cheese, jam, and other items. Reality at the front was less attractive. Tinned corned beef, bully beef, became a symbol of monotony. Hard biscuit could challenge teeth. Macaroni, a tinned meat and vegetable stew, inspired more jokes than affection. Hot food often arrived cold, late, or not at all when shelling cut communications. Yet monotony is not the same as systemic collapse. The British complaint was often that the same preserved foods appeared repeatedly. The German urban complaint increasingly concerned whether food appeared at all. Logistics also shaped combat power. A hungry soldier tires sooner. A unit short of horses cannot move its guns. An army without fuel cannot exploit a breakthrough. An offensive consumes supplies faster, precisely when damaged roads and railways make delivery hardest. Germany still possessed an effective railway network and a deeply experienced army. Its quartermasters performed extraordinary work under impossible conditions. The Central Powers also extracted resources from occupied territories, frequently at terrible cost to local civilians. But by 1918, German logistics had fewer reserves and less flexibility. Horses were weak, motor transport was limited, fuel and rubber were scarce. The railway system carried military traffic, coal, workers, weapons, and food through a country whose civilian economy also depended on those same wagons. The difference between the two sides was not that one always ate well and the other never did. It was redundancy. If one British source failed, global shipping might provide another. If a route was damaged, engineers and labor units attempted to restore or bypass it. If civilians had to consume less meat, the government could preserve priority for armies in France. The system could absorb shocks. Germany's system had been absorbing shocks since 1914. By the final year, each new disruption struck a structure with fewer alternatives. This imbalance became visible during Germany's last great offensive. Part 6. The Advance that outran its stomach. On March 21, 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael. Russia had left the war. German divisions transferred from the east gave the High Command a temporary advantage in the west. The United States was sending increasing numbers of soldiers across the Atlantic, but most were not yet ready for major operations. Germany needed victory before American strength became overwhelming. The opening attack was enormous. Thousands of guns and mortars struck British positions. Storm troops moved through fog, infiltrating weak points and bypassing strong defenses. In several sectors, the British front collapsed. German forces advanced across ground that had remained almost fixed for years. The tactical achievement was real, so was the logistical trap. The attackers moved into the devastated Somme battlefield, where years of artillery fire and deliberate destruction had ruined roads and railways. Horse-drawn transport struggled through cratered ground. Guns, ammunition, kitchens, and food could not keep pace with the leading infantry. The farther the advance traveled, the longer and weaker the supply route became. German troops also entered abandoned British positions and supply dumps. Accounts describe men encountering stocks of food and drink that revealed the material resources behind the Allied line. Chocolate, preserved foods, alcohol, and other goods were not merely luxuries to exhausted soldiers. They were evidence that unrestricted submarine warfare had not reduced the British Army to German conditions. The episode must not be exaggerated into a single cause of defeat. Soldiers stopping to loot did not by itself destroy the offensive. The more important failures were operational: unclear objectives, exhausted assault formations, heavy casualties among elite troops, insufficient mobile reserves, and the inability to move artillery and supplies across wrecked terrain. By early April, Operation Michael had advanced as far as 40 miles in places, but failed to capture Amiens or separate the British and French armies. Later, German offensives gained more ground and inflicted more casualties, yet none produced the decisive political or military result Ludendorff required. The German army had demonstrated that it could break a trench system. It had not demonstrated that it could feed and equip a breakthrough long enough to turn it into victory. This was the central contradiction of 1918. Germany could concentrate guns, ammunition, and highly trained assault troops for a spectacular opening blow. It could not regenerate those resources as effectively as its enemies. Each offensive consumed men and material that were increasingly difficult to replace. The Allies suffered terrible losses too. In March and April, British formations retreated, broke, and nearly lost vital positions. Victory was not predetermined by a ration table, but after the German offensive stopped, the supply balance remained. Britain and France still received global resources. American soldiers and American production continued to arrive. Allied transport and command were reorganized. Germany had spent the strategic reserve created by Russia's withdrawal. In August, the direction of movement reversed. and the number of German prisoners began to rise with extraordinary speed. Part 7. The 100 Days and the Human Flood. On August 8, 1918, the Allies attacked at Amiens. The battle combined artillery, tanks, aircraft, infantry, and carefully managed surprise. South of the Somme, the German line opened. Allied forces took approximately 13,000 prisoners on the first day and captured more than 300 guns. Erich Ludendorff later called August 8th the Black Day of the German army, not simply because ground had been lost, but because men surrendered in numbers that suggested a deeper collapse of confidence. Amiens began the 100 Days, a succession of Allied offensives that pressed the German army backward until the armistice. The phrase can make the campaign sound like a continuous victorious march. It was not. German units continued to resist fiercely. Allied casualties were severe. Strong positions had to be taken through coordinated attacks, and mistakes still killed thousands. But the strategic direction had changed. Germany no longer possessed the reserves to recover fully between blows. Allied armies struck in different sectors, denied the Germans a long pause, and forced repeated withdrawals. Every retreat threatened guns, stores, railways, field kitchens, hospitals, and men who could not move quickly enough. In 1917, British forces captured more than 73,000 enemy combatants. In 1918, they captured more than 200,000. Those figures did not all describe men sent to Britain. Many remained in France, where prisoners worked behind the lines. Officers were more likely to be transported across the Channel, and policy changed as camps and labor demands evolved. But the battlefield captures produced a growing human problem that had to be processed as systematically as ammunition or wounded soldiers. A newly captured man was disarmed and searched. He might be questioned for immediate intelligence, unit, strength, morale, positions, and the location of reserves. He required medical attention if wounded, delousing if infested, food if available, and transport away from the fighting. His name had to enter a record system so that governments and families could eventually learn he was alive. The first hours could be dangerous and chaotic. The Hague Convention's clean legal language did not always survive the anger of battle. Prisoners were killed after surrender in incidents on several fronts and by several armies. Men might also face shellfire while being marched through the combat zone. Captivity was not automatically safety. Once a prisoner reached a stable collecting point, however, he entered the enemy's administrative machine. That transition mattered. On the battlefield, he had seen the visible weapons of Allied power, tanks, aircraft, guns, and fresh formations. Behind the front, he encountered the less dramatic structure supporting them: traffic control, medical stations, railway timetables, supply dumps, clerks, kitchens, and guards. The meal at a cage or transit camp was not evidence of kindness alone. It was evidence that the enemy had planned for his capture. An army that expects to advance must prepare to handle enemy prisoners. Guards have to be assigned without weakening the attack. Roads must carry captives in the opposite direction from troops and ammunition. Food must be allocated to men who, only hours earlier, were trying to stop the advance. During the final months of 1918, Britain and its empire performed this task on a rapidly expanding scale. By November, the number of people held in Britain itself reached about 116,000. Nearly 90,000 had served in the German army, including more than 5,000 officers. Across the world, Britain held responsibility for a much larger population. The captives had become another army, an unarmed army that still required camps, guards, clothing, doctors, records, trains, and food. Part 8. Britain Behind the Wire. There was no single experience of being a German prisoner in Britain. By January 1918, official lists contained hundreds of places of internment. The number included major parent camps, hospitals, and small working detachments. A farm employing a handful of prisoners could appear in the same administrative universe as a camp holding thousands. Accommodation varied accordingly. Some men occupied purpose-built wooden huts resembling army barracks. Others lived in converted factories, schools, stables, tents, castles, or older military installations. Officers were separated from enlisted men and exempted from compulsory labor under the Hague Rules. Civilian internees formed another population whose legal position and experience should not be confused with captured soldiers. Neutral inspection reports usually judged treatment in Britain fair, but fair did not mean pleasant. Huts could be cold, damp, crowded, or poorly maintained. Prisoners complained about sanitation and the quality of food. Influenza did not stop at barbed wire. Discipline could be harsh. The absence of privacy wore men down. Captivity removed the immediate danger of battle while replacing it with uncertainty that had no visible end. For enlisted prisoners, labor structured the day. Britain had lost millions of workers to military service. Agriculture, forestry, quarrying, roadwork, and other sectors needed hands. The number of working prisoners rose from fewer than 4,000 in September 1916 to more than 45,000 by June 1918, and to roughly 67,000 by December. There was a practical irony in sending German prisoners to British farms. Germany's food production had declined, partly because agricultural workers and horses were taken for war. Britain answered its own labor shortage partly by placing captured enemy soldiers on the land. The prisoners did not become free farm workers. They remained under guard, received regulated pay and conditions, and could be punished. Employers and military authorities negotiated their use, yet their labor contributed to the food system that maintained Britain, including, indirectly, the system that fed the prisoners themselves. Work could be exhausting, but it also removed men from the monotony of the main camps. A prisoner assigned to a rural detachment saw British fields, villages, livestock, and civilian life at close range. His experience depended greatly on the guard, employer, local population, and nature of the task. It might involve hostility, curiosity, limited human contact, or all three. Prisoners who did not work constructed their own institutions behind the wire. Camps developed orchestras, theatre companies, newspapers, sports, lectures, craft workshops, religious services, and libraries. Stobbs in Scotland produced a camp newspaper. Handforth's library catalogue listed more than 2,500 books in 1916. Educational programs expanded in several camps. These activities do not transform imprisonment into a holiday. They demonstrate how captives fought psychological erosion. The Swiss physician Adolf Lucas Vischer studied what became known as barbed wire disease. Men suffered from depression, irritability, inability to concentrate, obsession with home, and the mental consequences of living without control over time. No ration could cure the uncertainty of not knowing when captivity would end. Letters therefore became central. In one camp account, the arrival of post was described as the alpha and omega of existence. The mood of the camp rose and fell with the mail, and in 1918, letters from Germany carried news that made the prisoners' physical surroundings even more difficult to interpret. They were captive in the enemy's country, but the enemy could still feed them more reliably than some of their own families could feed themselves. Part 9. 2 ration scales, 1 broken assumption. Return to the 2 documents. The British parliamentary answer from February 1918 stated that German and other prisoners received 30 ounces of meat each week, 6 ounces of pickled beef on 2 days, and 6 ounces of fresh meat on 3. At Donington Hall, German officers could purchase or receive a regulated daily list that included bread, potatoes, vegetables, milk, jam, oatmeal, coffee, and either meat on 5 days or fish on 2. The scale was being debated precisely because British supplies were tight. The October German Homefront scale recorded 50 grams of meat, 57 grams of fat, 25 grams of butter, bread, legumes, flour, potatoes, marmalade, milk, and an extremely small sugar allowance for the week. Again, the comparison has limits. The British figure was from February, the German figure from October. The first concerned prisoners, the second the home front. Germany's official allowance differed by locality and category. British camp practice could vary, and formal rations could be reduced or replaced. Neither list proves exactly what every individual swallowed, but official scales reveal state priorities and capacities. A government that announces a ration accepts responsibility for assembling and distributing it. Britain's prisoner ration was reduced during wartime scarcity, yet it still contained recognizable protein, starch, vegetables, and hot drinks. Germany's late-war civilian ration revealed an economy desperately short of fat and animal protein. In qualitative terms, the 1918 German diet could be worse even when the gross number of calories improved after the Turnip Winter. The prisoners understood the home front reality through correspondence. By September 1918, families repeatedly said they could send nothing. The painful line about not daring to ask for even a pin came from this world. For much of the war, parcels had supplemented military and prisoner diets. British and French captives in Germany often depended heavily on food sent from home and organized relief. Those without access to parcels, especially Russians, Romanians, and later prisoners held in labor companies near the front, could suffer terribly. This creates another important contrast. Britain's ability to send food parcels to its own prisoners was itself a form of national logistics. A captive's survival could depend on whether his homeland possessed food, packaging, money, postal organization, diplomatic agreements, and transportation routes that crossed enemy borders. German families gradually lost that capacity. They were no longer supplying abundance from home to the captive. Their letters documented their own deprivation. For a German prisoner eating British bread and meat, the meal did not need to be lavish to carry meaning. It only needed to be more secure than the uncertain ration described by his wife or mother. No propaganda speech was necessary. The argument was sitting in the bowl. Part 10. What the blockade did and what it did not do. The food crisis became one of the most powerful stories Germany told about its defeat. The British hunger blockade, the story said, had attacked women and children, destroyed national health, and forced a still undefeated army to accept peace. This interpretation contained truth. Allied policy deliberately restricted trade. By the final phase, it targeted goods connected to the civilian economy as well as direct military supplies. The blockade continued after the armistice as leverage during peace negotiations, prolonging suffering in German cities. But the simplest version turns a complex failure into a single enemy weapon. Economic historians have shown that Germany's own decisions were also decisive. War cut Germany off from important trading partners regardless of naval interception. Agricultural land and labor declined. The army received priority. Food was hoarded in producing regions. Price ceilings discouraged legal sales. Coal and transport shortages interfered with distribution. Urban consumers lost access, while rural areas sometimes retained supplies. The blockade did not reach into a German field and order a farmer to withhold potatoes from Berlin. German policy did not command the Royal Navy to stop overseas cargo. Both explanations are necessary. Allied sea power reduced the resources entering the Central Powers. German mobilization and administration then distributed the remaining pain unevenly and often incompetently. Hunger emerged from their interaction. The same caution applies to military collapse. Hungry civilians weakened morale and political stability. Letters carried despair into the army. Malnourished workers produced less. Weak horses and scarce fodder reduced transport. Food shortages therefore affected the war at many levels. Yet German soldiers did not simply drop their rifles because one weekly ration fell below a particular number. Units fought effectively until the final days. Defeat resulted from casualties, Allied material superiority, American arrival, operational failure, political crisis, the exhaustion of Germany's allies, and the impossibility of achieving a decisive victory. Food was not the only cause. It was the thread connecting many causes. Ships determined imports, coal determined trains, trains determined city supplies and artillery movement, fertilizer affected harvests and explosives, horses pulled plows and guns, workers made shells and stood in food queues. A ration issued to a prisoner exposed the condition of the entire structure. The lesson is not that humane treatment won the war, nor is it that Britain possessed unlimited abundance. The lesson is that a state can survive shortage if it preserves access, distribution, and public cooperation. A state with food on its territory can still experience hunger if those systems fail. Part 11. Victory, Captivity, and the Long Wait Home. At 11 in the morning on November 11th, 1918, the guns stopped. For German prisoners, the armistice did not open the gates. The legal end of fighting and the practical return of hundreds of thousands of captives were different problems. Governments had to exchange lists, arrange ships and trains, decide priorities, and separate military prisoners from civilians. The Allies also retained prisoners as labor, while peace terms remained unsettled. The delay was psychologically crushing. Men who had counted the days until peace now discovered that peace did not contain a date for home. The barbed wire remained. Guards remained. Work continued. Letters described revolution, political violence, demobilization, unemployment, and continuing food shortages in Germany. By July 1919, Britain still held responsibility for more than 458,000 internees and prisoners globally. On British soil, the figure had fallen to about 90,000. General repatriation of German prisoners from Britain did not begin until September 1919. Over the following months, tens of thousands finally returned. They returned to a country transformed. The Kaiser was gone. The empire had become a republic. The blockade and internal dislocation had not vanished on Armistice Day. Urban working-class families continued to face severe conditions. Veterans entered a society divided over why the war had been lost. Many Germans would later accept the myth that the army had remained undefeated in the field and had been stabbed in the back by revolutionaries, socialists, and Jews at home. The myth ignored the military reality visible in the final campaign: retreat, mass captures, collapsing allies, exhausted reserves, and an enemy whose material power continued to grow. The prisoners themselves had seen part of that reality from behind the wire. They had watched the British state convert captured manpower into farm labor. They had eaten from a ration system sustained after the U-boat crisis. They had seen a society under strain but still capable of housing, recording, guarding, and feeding its enemies. This does not mean captivity automatically converted prisoners into admirers of Britain. Some remained intensely nationalist. Some believed they had been mistreated. Some remembered hunger, cold, insults, or years stolen from their lives. Historical experience does not produce one uniform political conclusion, but the contrast could not be completely unseen. The nation Germany had tried to starve into surrender had survived. The nation that expected to endure a long war had reached the armistice with 50 grams of meat on an official weekly civilian ration. Conclusion: the weight of a meal. The First World War is often explained through the weight of shells. It can also be understood through the weight of meat, 30 ounces per week for German prisoners in Britain, according to a parliamentary answer in February 1918. 50 grams per week on a German home front ration scale in October. The numbers should not be forced into a false precision. They were recorded 8 months apart. They described different people. Actual consumption varied. Britain had shortages, Germany had black markets, and neither document can reconstruct every meal. But together, they reveal the direction of the war. Britain's food system had come close to disaster under submarine attack. It responded with convoys, rationing, greater state control, imperial resources, allied shipping, and a vast military distribution network. The result was not comfort for everyone. It was survival with enough capacity left to maintain enemy captives. Germany's food system began the war with confident calculations about self-sufficiency. It was weakened by blockade, the loss of trade, conscription, reduced cultivation, shortages of fertilizer and horses, military priority, transport problems, hoarding, black markets, and failed distribution. It did not collapse everywhere in the same way. It failed most brutally for urban civilians who had the least power to escape the official ration. By 1918, a German soldier could cross the line as a prisoner and move from one food economy into another. He might dislike the cooking. He might resent every mouthful given by his captor. He might work under guard, sleep in an uncomfortable hut, and spend months wondering when he would see home. Then a letter could arrive telling him that home had nothing to send. That is the moment at the center of this story. Not an invented expression of shock, but a documented reversal of dependence. The prisoner was being maintained by the enemy. His family was being failed by its own war economy. The meal did not prove that Britain was morally pure. The blockade imposed suffering. The empire supplied resources through unequal power, and prisoner treatment was shaped by labor and military interest as well as humanity. It proved something narrower and harder. Britain could still make the system function. In industrial war, courage can hold a trench, tactics can break a line, artillery can open a road. But armies and societies continue only if ships arrive, trains run, horses pull, farms produce, clerks count, and food reaches the people whose bodies the war requires. The final defeat of Germany was written in casualty lists and captured guns. It was also written on ration cards. And for thousands of German prisoners in Britain, the strategic balance of the First World War could be measured in the ordinary weight of bread, potatoes, and 30 ounces of meat.